Okay, and to conclude the phenomenal run that William Hurt had throughout the 80s, obviously excluding A Time of Destiny because that movie is apparently impossible to find and not on the face of the earth anymore, as far as I've looked. We come to The Accidental Source, which is another collaboration with him and Lawrence Kasdan, who we talked about with Body Heat and then The Big Chill. And the interesting about this is it does kind of, as we kind of go through it, it almost kind of seems like a culmination of those previous collaborations kind of coming together with this one. And it is based on the Ann Tyler book, the very, very good Ann Tyler book that I also highly recommend. But to talk about the movie itself is actually a bit of a challenge. It might seem like, just another movie, but and you'll notice the person that I bought it off of put this sticker on it for some reason, which is a terrible choice with these old Warner Brothers cases, but whatever. But the challenge that comes with talking about The Accidental Divorce, one of them, is as far as like discussing, its themes and what's going on here exactly, and where exactly the emotion is coming from. It's an interesting story and movie because to just describe what the plot is essentially to announce the themes. Where you're talking about a guy that's like extremely emotionally closed off, and he's obviously gone through this huge tragedy with his wife, and now his wife wants to divorce him, and he's being put in all these extremely uncomfortable and emotionally vulnerable places. And yet he's a person that just does not show emotion because of all his fears and this need to control his fears and to look at his career where he writes these guidebooks where people can basically do the same thing, where they can travel without having to do anything that might be sort of outside the box or outside of their comfort zone. And then naturally he meets somebody who is pretty much the opposite of him that might be able to break him out of this. And it's like, that seems to just basically spell out everything that the movie's about. So it's like, it feels less like something to sort of discuss and more just like now that you know that theme and what it is, it's how it plays out and how these particular characters explore themselves through it and find things about themselves through it. And what the movie also does quite skillfully is, especially when you look at it being an adaptation of the book, where it makes this really ingenious decision at the very start, where there's two separate scenes in the book. There's the very first scene in the book is when they're in the car in the rain, and that's when Sarah says that she wants a divorce, and then there's a later scene kind of in the middle where they have lunch and they kind of have this conversation and you're not quite sure where it's going to go, if they might be able to reconcile, if they might not, if it's a lost cause. And this scene towards the beginning of the movie takes both of those scenes out of the book and just puts them together as one. Where it's just kind of this full discussion of she wants a divorce, can they fix it, how are they going to fix it. Megan has this really outlandish possible idea to try that just gets immediately shot down by both of them. And to bring that here is to bring in a lot of exposition, but what's really great about this is that it brings in a lot of exposition but manages to still feel like a real conversation. And as far as also getting information to the audience, when they're not using exact exposition, we're getting these flashbacks. And to talk about the flashbacks also talks about the other challenge of talking about this movie and what this movie has to approach is the tonal challenge. Because at the end of the day, even though it may not feel like it at all, the movie is basically a comedy. In its heart, it's a comedy, but it's dealing with this very dramatic subject matter that it takes very seriously. And you have the moment when she wants a divorce, and then everything that comes with divorce, like the awkward phone calls, when we do this thing, should we be together or should we be not in the same room? All of that stuff that feels real. And then there's the tragedy surrounding the fact that their son was murdered during a holdup. Their 12-year-old son, who was killed in one of the worst ways that you can imagine. And we have this flashback towards the beginning of the movie that's actually quite tone-setting for this comedy, where Macon is tasked with going back to the morgue and identifying the body. But the thing is that this scene is so telling about Megan as a character, because you see this, and it's like you've seen this scene before plenty of times, and you've seen where there's like shock, but there's also like, you know, a lot of dramatization and a lot of big emotions, which make perfect sense. But then every now and then you get a scene like this one, and one that really is kind of drawing the character out, which is, this is where most characters would have like a big breaking scene, seeing what we know he's looking at without seeing it for ourselves. And as far as like this would be when a character breaks in a big way, this is definitely him breaking, but in a different way. Where we've talked about, he's already has his life outlined to make sure that there's not a lot of like high risk factors, and that he doesn't really have to confront a lot of his fears, and that he can kind of be closed in. And this is just sort of, instead of those emotions coming out, they're just going further and further back, and making this whole barrier that he has just significantly thicker. So if he seemed like really sort of, you know, boxed off and downplayed before, he's got to go all in now on being boxed in and like just being as far away from the outside world as possible. So, yeah, naturally, like any story, he's going to meet a character that's the exact opposite. A character that's very outgoing, kind of bizarrely outgoing. Like, even for outgoing people, Muriel might be a lot. Which is great about this, especially because, obviously, Gina Davis won her Oscar for this, and it does seem like a very basic character on the surface. Like, when you look at the plot, the way it's laid out like that, you're like, okay, this is a big character that doesn't really think much about what other people think, and is just herself in a really big way all the time. And that's essentially true, but at the same time, it does almost seem like, not just in any other circumstance, but in the early scenes with Muriel, that there would be a naivete that comes with that. Where it's like where it's almost like she's oblivious to the world, and that's why she's the way that she is. Which is where a lot of the brilliance in the performance comes in, because as it goes on, we start to see that she's pretty much anything but naive, and she's had her own experiences, and even her own sense of jadedness that starts to come out the more her and Megan's maybe relationship, maybe not, we're not really quite sure for a while. They're not really quite sure for a while. But yeah, she does have, you know, those quirks in her that you'd expect from a character like this. Like what would later be known as the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, you could probably put the early scenes of Muriel in, where she's the kind of character where if you owe her 4 cents, she'll like make a mental note of that, and just sort of say things without really much of a filter. Like her small child here, Alexander, I think, is pretty much anything seems to be able to possibly kill this kid. And so when he's sitting right next to her in the car, like it's any other conversation, she describes to Megan all the things that are wrong with him, all the things that could hurt him, and she talks about bee stings and how, oh, if he gets stung by a bee, he could be dead in half an hour. And we just assume this is something the kid hears every day. Like, he's used to the fact that it's this out in the open. Not just his, you know, effects or whatever, but the fact that Muriel is so open about literally everything. But then, yeah, like I was saying, as it goes on, we do start to see more of how she's kind of aware of the way that this clashes with other people, and how she's probably been through situations like she's gone through with Megan before, just maybe not quite somebody as, like, locked down or as trying to hide themselves from the world. And so it's almost like a task in the same way that her training Edward, his dog, is a task in itself. So, like I said, all you have to do is explain the plot, and it's like all the themes are there. It's just a matter of how they play out from here. So we get these really amazing scenes. There's one scene in the middle here that's probably my favorite scene in the movie, which is when Macon finally decides he's actually it's not even intentional on his part. It's one of those cases where he's accidentally put in a situation that allows him to open up a little bit, which was probably going to be the only way that was going to happen. So fate was just kind of on his side in that regard, where he goes to leave her this letter saying that he can't come to dinner because he just can't. I feel like some of us have enough anxiety in us to where we can relate to Macon in some, maybe not in his entire sense, but in some way where it's like sometimes you just can't do it, regardless of what you're coming from or what your experiences are, and it's like people like me where it's just inherently in there at all times. I don't know to the extreme nature of Macon, and certainly not because of Macon's experiences, but yeah, but there are very relatable moments, like, you know, finding the excuses to just kind of not be around people, and like you have no intention, and it's not that you dislike these people, it's just you just kind of dislike the situation of being just around in general people. It's kind of a hard thing to explain, but I feel like most people in the world have felt it and understand it. So when he gets to this point where we understand it's nothing against Muriel, really, it's just, you just can't do a social thing. You just can't. But then he gets caught leaving this letter, and then in this kind of moment where, what's brilliant about what Muriel does here is, if I remember correctly, between her opening the letter and reading it silently to when they get upstairs and she's like undressing him, she doesn't say anything, which is obviously totally different from her character, which is another way that shows you that side of her where it's like she seems like she's this no-filter person, this person that'll just say literally anything and everything, but she is a character that knows when she just needs to listen and hear somebody, and the fact that she does this so naturally means that this is not a new thing for her, to know when to just sort of let somebody else do the open up and the talking and all that. So this point where he talks about Ethan, really for the first time as far as like in detail here, like we kind of get the feeling he's never even had this conversation with Sarah really much, at least not to this extent. And then we get this moment where she silently takes him upstairs and undresses him, and what's interesting about this is it's not necessarily just because the movie's rated PG and they're not going to show us a sex scene. It's the tasteful way that they show what this connection is, because when I was saying it's interesting how this feels like kind of a culmination of his Body Heat and Big Chill rules, is the fact that when we talked about Body Heat, we talked about, you know, passion and how sex can be this thing that really, really kind of connects you with this person. In Body Heat, it was like to the point of obsession. But here it would be like this sort of a passion kind of, like all these emotions that have been packed away are sort of, you know, coming out in this sort of passionate moment, but there's no passion in this. Like it's basically, the sex in this scene is essentially consoling more than anything else. But it's still like, while it's not this passionate breakthrough that you would expect, or like the passionate way that we talked about sex is used in Body Heat, there's still, like, it still feels like there's a bit of a breakthrough here, to where it's like it's the baby steps for him to start like feeling, and the way they portray that and use that is something that's really, it's got such this real quality to it that's kind of hard to articulate it in exactly, but like we were saying, the way the character is so closed off to the point, especially with the way a lot of these scenes, especially when they're like, when she's just like holding him and the camera's kind of really close on them, because we had the line at one point where she asks Macon if he goes to the movies, and his response is, I don't care for movies, they make everything seem so close up. And it's like, just that being able to not confront emotion that much, to the point that you can't even really see it on screen, and then to see the movie play it out in that way. Once again, it's something that you probably wholly expect to see coming, but it's the way this movie so tenderly executes, so sensitively executes it, and makes the characters feel like they're real people, that are confronting this, and how it's because the movie has so much compassion in it, and the tricky thing about it is that we're seeing all this compassion on display from various characters in various forms, through a character that cannot express that, cannot express really compassion or even like anything that might be overwhelming, or even like be a very visible sort of feeling. So everything Hurt has to do here is very internalized. So when we get the big moments, we kind of don't realize right away that they're big moments. Like the whole subplot with Bill Pullman and the sister Rose, where it's this really sweet subplot where they're like kind of falling in love in the background more or less. But this is a family that like almost seems to not allow this thing to happen, like doesn't allow these outside factors to happen because everything is so concise in their living space, whether it be like the way they alphabetize everything or their game that makes no sense to anybody but them. And it's like any sort of outside factor is going to throw everything off. And so when we get this moment where he's able to, in this very small way, in this very seemingly effortless way, bring Rose like all this happiness, and bring her to this point of contentedness that seems so far away from Megan himself, feels like a breakthrough in itself, where he gets Bill Pullman to tell her, hey, maybe you should come and work for me, and then that'll kind of help their relationship and kind of get her away from having to basically see over the family like a mother, when it's her brothers. And it's like to be able to get away from that, but also be able to be in this area that she wants to be in, as far as like kind of being in control in around her own environment, while also being with Bill Pullman and not having to completely separate herself from her family, but not have to be constantly there either. And how it almost seems like this is like once he gets that call from her, and he realizes that it's possible that you can step out and still find some sort of contentedness. And how this comes at pretty much just the right time, because we eventually get to this point where Paris happens and both women are here. And of course, we get what appears to be another love triangle scenario, like we talked about with Broadcast News. But the interesting thing about this is that the way they've set this up, and the way the characters come in and out, and the way he responds to the characters, and the characters respond to him, it really sets up like you have no idea who he's going to end up with, and if either one will even take him at the end of the day. And so, like, because he's been rejected by one, and he's kind of rejecting the other, and then these things kind of all these lines kind of start to blur as the characters become more and more real. Like, the reason that this works so well is that the way they respond to each other and talk to each other, and the methods they use to make the decisions that they make feel so much like real people. It doesn't feel like a script is bringing these people together and a script is asking you, oh, who is it going to be? It just kind of feels like you're just watching it play out and hoping that they all find some form of happiness or whatever. But you don't really get the sense that it has a planned destination. It's going to take the series of events to get wherever we end up. And that's what really separates it, because this could easily feel like a Hallmark movie. Like, even whether it's all the stuff we talked about, or even all the stuff with Alexander, where he's like kind of becoming this father figure, and he's kind of like filling the hole that Ethan left. And there's the moment where like he takes his hand and stuff like that. This is all stuff that could have seemed overly sentimental. Like I said, pretty much like a Hallmark movie, but it's how real the emotions feel, almost too real the emotions feel, that it feels like the movie's on a completely different level than something like that. And how it's able to take moments like this of what people might call sentimentality or whatever, which always sounds like such a dirty word when people say it. But like when it's done right, it's something that can feel not just heartwarming, but really real. And bring out these feelings that you may have felt before, or maybe feelings that you desire to feel, and brings them to life in a way. So, and I think the kind of the magic of it also is, despite the fact that Gina Davis got her well-deserved Oscar for this, the thing that really has to make it work is Hurt's performance at the center of it. being so boxed off and being so, emotionally vacant would be really off-putting from a performance that was just kind of like surface level or one note. But Hurt kind of has always had this whole ability to take a character that might seem sort of, rough on the surface or off-putting on the surface, but there was always something at least extremely likable about him. Like, even if he's a character that you wouldn't, like, completely, like, fall in love with or something, like, you want to see this person reach their goal, whoever it was he was playing. Even when he was bad guys, there was something so, like, just insanely watchable about it. And so playing a character like this who is so emotionally walled off, yet we always wanted to see him reach what the final moment of this movie is. That moment where he finally does find a reason to crack a smile. And it's for all the right reasons, and there's definitely a beauty to that, and something that would be very, very hard to replicate, because we were talking about the whole reason we even did this series is because of how big of a blow it is to the industry to lose somebody like William Hurt, who's able to do all this stuff, whether it be big lead roles like most of these in the 80s were, or kind of the smaller parts that he started to play towards the end, or just everything in the middle. There was always like some sort of authenticity and likability and magnetism and all that stuff. So that pretty much sums up why we did this whole thing. So I guess that's pretty much all we can do here. So now that we finished this up, we should be finishing up the Versa stuff for September, and anything else for September. We have one more review video too, I believe, like Hocus Pocus 2 and Blonde and stuff like that. And then we'll be in October when we get to do all the horror stuff, which I'm really excited about. So I think that's what we're looking into now. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.